everybody. This is Joe Moore coming back at you with Psychedelics today. I'm recording here in beautiful, sunny Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Jesse Gould, who is the founder of Heroic Hearts Project, which is a really cool nonprofit that's doing some great psychedelic work with veterans. Quite the disadvantaged population, and mental health care in the federal system is really tough in the States, and it's coming along slowly but surely. But some people might actually just need some psychedelics to help, and this helps raise funds for folks to go to ayahuasca ceremonies in legal countries, which is really cool. We get into a lot of the details around the project in the show, and I think it's a really important project. We got to briefly meet in the Phoenix, what is it called? The Arizona Psychedelics Conference. That was a few months ago, which is really neat. And yeah, just connecting on the phone, I think there could be some really fun partnerships with his group in the future with psychedelics today, but time will tell. If you want to support the show, we'd love any kind of support you can provide for us. The biggest thing on our radar right now is 3 different versions of the live Navigating Psychedelics course. We're doing our first ever course for physicians. We have Dr. Matt Brown, longtime friend of the show, helping us teach that one. We've got probably a few other doctors will jump in here and there to help, but we don't have those names announced yet. As the sales kind of come in and firm up our financing, we should be able to afford some other doctors to help out with that class. The clinician track is for therapists and nurses, people who are not physicians but are looking to do this work professionally somehow. This will be for you. So Kyle and I are teaching that. We're going to bring in some guest teachers. Hopefully, none of those are booked, but we've got a very large list of people that could help us teach it. So it's going to be amazing. And then we have a live Navigating Psychedelics for a general audience. Those are going to be really fun as well. So you get to just really understand how to be safer with this stuff, understanding where the benefits might come from. The the field of psychedelic education is a little tough right now. Yes, some of it's available. It's in plenty of books, but there's not too many classes and places you can go to chat about this. And this is our, foray into that space, supporting each other in learning on a Slack group. If you're not familiar with Slack, it's just an amazing chat program that helps, get us out of Facebook a little bit and, a little less surveillance, which is always good, especially in this world. And it's just looking really positive for all this stuff. And if you want to get more education, dig in with us. It's, I really wish I had this 10 years ago. It would have saved us a ton of time. And I know I would have saved myself a lot of heartache and pain if I had taken these courses before. So check it out. psychedelicstodayshop.com under education is where you can find it. There will be some links on the main page, so dig in. We would love to have you join us, and if you think a doctor friend would benefit, maybe it's a gift for the doctor or you could take it with a doctor or something. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and as always, we'd love to hear from you. psychedelicstoday email@gmail.com. Just say hi. It's sometimes a little lonely on this side of the microphone because I'm up in the mountains, but anything helps. Just say hi and thanks and whatever, or critiques or whatever. And I would like that. So have a great rest of your day and enjoy this interview with Jesse Gould from the Heroic Hearts Project. Bye-bye. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. Today on the show, we have Jesse Gould from the Heroic Hearts Project. Read a quick bio here, and then we can jump right in. Jesse Gould founded the Heroic Hearts Project after an ayahuasca retreat in Iquitos, Peru in February 2017. During the week-long retreat, he instantly saw the healing potential of the drink and knew that it could be a powerful tool in healing mental struggles of his fellow veterans. Jesse was born in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and grew up in New Smyrna Beach. Did I say that right?
New Smyrna Beach.
Smyrna.
Close.
In 2009, graduated from Cornell with a degree in economics. After working in investment banking for a period, he enlisted in the Army and became an Airborne Ranger for 4 years and 3 combat deployments. Most recently, he worked in finance in Tampa, and after struggling with severe anxiety for years, he decided to go on an ayahuasca retreat, which had profound positive effects on his anxiety and daily life. So thank you for joining us, Jesse.
Hey, Joe, thank you so much for having me and giving my foundation a platform.
Absolutely. So we briefly met at the somewhat recent Phoenix Psychedelic Conference, which is really good. I guess they call it the Arizona Psychedelic Conference.
Right.
Yeah, it seemed like you guys were getting a lot of foot traffic, which is awesome to see. So I guess just as a foundation, let's get started talking about what is Heroic Hearts and mainly what do you do?
Yeah, of course. So like at the Arizona conference, we're trying to be the voice of veterans within the psychedelic community, which from the outside might not seem to be a good mix, but it actually there's a lot of synergies there. And at the conference, we got a lot of very positive feedback. So the Foundation Heroic Hearts Project, like it said in my bio, I started after my own struggles and finding very few options through the Department of Veteran Affairs and having to figure out my own solutions and answers. And I found that through ayahuasca. And, I fully realized that ayahuasca and other psychedelics are not for everybody, but in my mind, it should be at the very least on more people's radar. And we should all be in favor of taking those steps forward that we can research them and understand more about various psychedelic compounds to better treat these mental illnesses that the veteran community and the world in general are experiencing. But currently the veteran community is experiencing a mental health crisis. A lot of people hear about the crazy amount of suicides every day in the veteran community, high levels of PTSD, addiction. All of these affect the veteran community at much higher rates than general population. And organizations like MAPS have done a tremendous job leading this path forward with their MDMA studies. But there's a lot more that we can do. There's a lot more that we can learn. And I strongly believe that through the veteran voice is one of the best ways to push the psychedelic cause forward. Because fortunately in the U.S., veterans are pretty well trusted and, a respected group. And so if we can align the veteran voice with the psychedelic cause, that's a very powerful force for change.
I absolutely agree. So your story, like going down and seeing the profound healing and help that ayahuasca can bring, almost sounds like the story you hear from almost everybody. It's not, a total win for everybody, but it's a very substantial group that feels really helped. So I'm wondering if maybe you could speak to like what you've seen so far with some folks you've been able to help with your organization.
Right, and it's always a work in progress. Like you said, it's you hear a similar story enough. And that's kind of what we're trying to use. There is a lot of scientific evidence, but the anecdotal evidence is overwhelming. Anybody who can look at this objectively can easily see that there's something there, something beyond just people trying to escape with drugs or whatever. And so that's what we're trying to have people question of, like, there's all this evidence here. Why aren't we doing more to investigate it? But it's a work in progress. And so we're always trying to figure out, for the people that don't necessarily get that much, how can we improve it, or how can we keep the lessons that they learn? And we were talking about this earlier, and this is a very common theme nowadays, fortunately, is that integration is so important. And that's the process before and after the actual ceremony of being prepared for the ayahuasca, so you're more open to it, so you understand what you're trying to achieve, and then keep on that good path, make positive choices, understand the negative choices you have been pursuing in your life, so you can avoid it. So with the veterans I've sent, because of funding, but also fortunately we're trying to do it in a slow process, smaller groups, so we can always try to tailor our program better and figure out, because we are dealing with a very powerful substance here, right? So we don't want to be irresponsible, and we don't want to cause more damage. And so, with each person, we try to tailor the care to them, figure out what will best work with them, figure out that in our vetting process as well, like which veterans do we feel like will get the most out of it. And so for the most part, the vast majority of people we've sent have gotten at least a small benefit from it. We haven't had any like negative or horrific or anything like that experiences. Some people may have had only like a slight benefit, and so that's on me to figure out why and how to improve it. And I've come across a few people that say, oh, it wasn't really for me and nothing really happened, but then I view their life and it seems like everything since that point has been going better. So that's also the hard part about psychology and surveys too, because oftentimes it's hard for us to assess on a day-by-day basis, oh, I'm feeling this amount happier than I was a year ago. It's a very hard thing to gauge, but we're trying to be as receptive as possible.
Yeah, that's huge. It's research is also so complicated, and until you start getting really, really niched out with your data and your surveying and replicating, like it's so hard to know exactly who is going to get the help they need. But it's a question worth asking. And, even if they don't get the help they need, at least they tried. Like, I think these days antibiotics is still, great, but there's still a sliver of people that don't get the effect they need from it, which is pretty interesting.
Yeah, and at the very least, most of the, we've had some profound life-changing experiences, to be sure, but I like to focus on the ones that didn't get as much as I thought they would out of it and figure out why. And even on those cases, at the very least, it opened them up to realize that they do need to go on the path of healing. And that's, I think, in itself, a very powerful thing. And maybe they'll come back to ayahuasca down the line, or maybe they need something with a little bit different approach or a little bit stronger. So if you have like a guy I recently sent, he was very good at compartmentalizing and closing off. He was a Navy SEAL, and ayahuasca, it took him a while to kind of really get to the deep spot. In the final ceremony he did, and so that kind of opened him up to realize, oh, hey, there's a lot there that I need to uncover. And so he is going to probably pursue some ibogaine therapy later this summer, which might work a little bit better with the way he interprets the world, or might be more intense and help him get deeper. It's all a work in progress. And that's kind of what we're all trying to do together in the psychedelic community, is figure out what each of these substances, what benefits they have given the individual and the trauma.
Yeah, that's huge. An analogy we like to use here is you can't clean the whole house with a Swifter. Like it's got to be a whole suite of tools, depending on how serious the issue is. Sometimes it's just a little spill on the floor. It's okay. But sometimes it's systemic, and it's going to take a lot of tools, not just psychedelics. And or sometimes it just takes 2 or 3 ayahuasca sessions and you get a ton of healing. So maybe we can speak a little bit about like PTSD. I think there's some misconceptions out there around PTSD. Like people hear about it on the news and they assume that you just can't get through your day job, when it's not really true.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of the hard part about it. There's its own stigma around PTSD. And so even within the veteran community, there is a hesitation to even associate yourself with it, because it's become so it's such people have such a Hollywood view of it, of like what you see in the movies of the guy freaking out in the milk aisle, or waking up in the middle of the night, sweaty, choking his wife and not knowing where he is. And there are, a couple of cases of that, and, they need to be addressed. But that's not the entire spectrum of PTSD. And that, again, is kind of the hard aspect. PTSD is a very broad spectrum diagnosis. It's not extremely well understood, and it expands not only psychological levels but also physical levels. So there's new evidence that shows that a lot of PTSD symptoms are actually the result of brain damage from constant exposure to explosions, concussive force. And so, there's this whole variety of things, whether it's a traumatic event, whether it is a series of traumatic events. So people who had childhood abuse are much more susceptible to it, or maybe it's a physical kind of thing. And I feel like that's kind of, again, that's the beauty of psychedelics, of what they're showing, is because they can work on multiple levels. So something like ayahuasca, with the hallucination part, it has that psychological aspect. So you can revisit past traumas, but there also shows to be some sort of healing with the brain, whether the mechanism is reducing inflammation or neurogenesis or increasing plasticity. It's still hard to tell, but there seems to be multiple layers that it's helping these sort of issues, whereas the current accepted treatments are like SSRIs and medication, which target a very specific part of the brain, and it's still not very understood. And the repercussions of that can be more hazardous than the treatment itself. So, I mean, in my case, and this relates to a lot of veterans, is I was lucky. I didn't experience anything super traumatic. There was nobody like dying in my arms or anything like that. I experienced a lot of high stress situations and all this other kind of stuff, but I felt like I was able to process it pretty well. There wasn't anything that I have flashbacks of. But I came out and I was still definitely burdened by something, and it was very intangible, because it was a part of my mind that was just holding me back and making me much more susceptible to anxiety and depression and other issues, drinking too much, all this other kind of stuff. And like I said, the accepted treatments were not going to help it. Talk therapy, it's essential and it's a good component, but in itself, it's very limited in effect if you're experiencing these kind of things. And SSRIs tend to just null the pain or dull it out. They don't do anything towards healing. And so for me, I didn't associate myself with PTSD, because I was like, what would cause it? I don't know. And I had, through research and my own investigation, I realized that since I was a mortarman, I was exposed to a consistent amount of concussive forces. And so my issues were probably more of a physical issue. And it just is frustrating. It's saddening. And I know a lot of my buddies out there that have never heard of this either. Like, I had to figure it out on my own. And even though I was a mortarman, not one person in my out processing even mentioned traumatic brain injury or even mention any of this. And so it's ridiculous in my perspective that me, without any sort of medical experience, had to like go through PubMed and figure this stuff out myself.
Right. I was going to mention mortars earlier, and it's interesting that you were a mortarman. So like, yeah, that's just repeated concussive force on the brain. And a thing that Rogan kind of mentioned once in a while is this dude who does medical endocrinology. Have you heard of this guy? Out of Vegas? Dr.
Mark Gordon, possibly.
Yeah, exactly. Really interesting stuff. I don't know anybody that's been through his protocol, but I always hear him talk, and I'm like, the psychedelic community should know about this, but also he should know more about psychedelics, because perhaps it would be a lot easier of a fix. There's this thing I've been reading about in ayahuasca where it's almost like a stem cell emulator. So that could be a factor repairing brain, like damaged brain areas or something.
Yeah, he's definitely aware. I've communicated with him back and forth. It's just, especially after being on Joe Rogan, his own process and his own looking in whatever he's doing is obviously super successful, and he's trying to spread that through the community, and he's definitely open to it. I think anybody who's looked at any of the research, it's hard for them, if they're interested in the brain, to not be open to psychedelics. And I think he's done a little bit of work with an ibogaine center as well, which is pretty interesting that's
really cool.
And so, yeah, I mean, that's part, I don't necessarily, down the line, that's something Heroic Hearts Project wants to be more engaged in. If we get the funding and we get the support, it's a full spectrum. We want to be able to have almost like a menu of things that we can treat somebody based off of what they experience. And like you said, ayahuasca or any psychedelic can have a whole. It's hard for us to know the exact extent of help the person will receive from it, and we can supplement that with other sort of treatments, whether it be hyperbaric chambers or hormone replacement therapy. All these things in combination could be a very powerful sort of experience. Or even, once MDMA becomes accepted, I could easily foresee some sort of psychedelic to sort of break through the barriers, maybe heal some mental sort of stuff. If there's still some lingering things like the Navy SEAL I sent, maybe MDMA therapy is enough to, sort of empty out the basket of what they're holding in.
Yeah. How many people have you been able to fund so far to get down to ayahuasca centers?
So what we work on a few different levels, and one of them is financial scholarships. And, we're always trying to figure that out as well, because, donations are always hard to come by, especially now that everybody's asking for donations on Facebook and all this other kind of stuff. And we're still kind of in that gray area. And so we've been able to provide financial scholarships to some level to at least about 15 people. And then in terms of support, like logistic support or integration support, probably another dozen or so more. And, this year we're really looking to ramp it up. We're doing a big retreat in May, which will have like 7 veterans, and they're all very influential within the veteran community, either business owners or influencers. So we're really hoping if they have their own profound experience, that they will be good outlets to further expand our message in a much more in a much broader way. And then we're planning on some studies afterwards. So we recently got a grant from the company Ubiome. So we're going to be engaging in a official study to test the effects of ayahuasca on the gut microbiome. Because for people who are not familiar, there's a very strong connection between the microorganisms in a person's stomach and their emotions. And so that's why, if you eat healthier and all this other kind of stuff, and you take certain supplements, your mood will improve and you're less predisposed to depression. And so, I suspect that ayahuasca has to have some sort of effect on your gut. And so it's gonna be interesting to see how that works out.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you're doing that. It's fundamental thing to understand is that gut is super linked to important hormones that regulate our body. Like, I think the majority of our serotonin comes from our gut. So if that becomes a little dysregulated, we can become pretty dysregulated too, especially in a combat scenario when you're just under a ton of stress. One thing I thought was really, so kind of circling back to veteran stuff. So I was reading that mechanics who didn't necessarily go out and do, combat work or, tours, they would be deployed, but at a base, relatively safe base, doing a lot of mechanical work. They had a tremendously high rate of PTSD as well, relative to the general population. I thought that was also a really weird finding, but something that we should pay attention to. Perhaps it's the scenario. Just, you're always like under a time crunch, probably. You've got
yeah. There's a lot of factors, and that's what makes any sort of scientific study difficult, right? Especially those psychology is a very slippery thing to study. So, one, it could just be that they're constantly, as opposed to infantry guys where they get the chance to experience adrenaline that's in comparison to the stress they're feeling, people who are on base are always feeling the stress without the outlet. So that could be a possible thing. There could also be a thing that infantry or the more direct action jobs attract the people that are better able to handle that as well, and maybe mechanics or something else. So that's like another approach. So there's a whole different ways of interpreting it, but it's definitely, I think by looking into those things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, you better understand it. Just from my own experience, and I can speak to this because I went through the selection, I find special operations guys tend to do very well with psychedelic therapy, because oftentimes, like I mentioned before, a lot of times the PTSD or hardships with the war can relate to a person's way of interpreting events or the person's way of resilience after events. And so special operations already kind of filters that out. You have to, through whatever Navy SEAL, Ranger, Special Forces, you have to go through a selection process, which is pretty much just grinding you down, and you have to be able to cope with very harsh and stressful situations and be able to just figure out the objective and find a way to get there, And so it attracts, and it already filters out a certain type of mind frame. And so it can be hard for those guys because they're very good at compartmentalizing to get very deep into the emotions. But in terms of the hardships that are associated with something like ayahuasca, they tend to be very resilient towards it. And resilience is like a big thing that's associated with PTSD. Like I mentioned before, those that have childhood abuse or sexual assault tend to be much less resilient, and they are more inclined to be in the military. And again, possibly these other sort of jobs as well. That's the hard part of knowing. But then those people it can be hard. It can be I think a little bit more risky to do something like ayahuasca because it's so intense and you need a certain level of resilience. So when it gets, very hard, like my first experience was all out war, and it was, I almost lost perception of time and space, and it freaked me out. But my mind was set on what I needed to do. And so, that again, that's another point that we're trying to look into to figure out, because obviously we don't want to send somebody to ayahuasca and it just causes more chaos for them. And you don't want to re-traumatize them through the experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I think is under-discussed, this idea of psychedelics actually re-traumatizing. My partner in this show, Kyle Buller, is doing a really interesting project around breath work and how it could be used in a clinical setting. And the fact that you could have a re-traumatizing experience in breath work is kind of the fundamental assumption. And how do you ease them into it to avoid that? Right. Which I think is something that I think will develop in time with this field.
And how do you teach resilience techniques? Like, how do you get somebody to where when they fall off the horse, they're the personality that gets back on, as opposed to just dwelling in the moment of being off the horse? It's the same kind of thing with ayahuasca. Is two people that are very similar. They both go to this horrific experience through ayahuasca. Both will be shook by it the next day. One will want to go back and reattack it or figure out, or knows that that's a lesson that they're just not figuring out. The other person will just write it off, be like, nope, I'm done. I don't want to go. And so figuring out how to help people push through these hardships, I think will be a very important avenue of study to overcome things like PTSD and other mental traumas.
Yeah, that's huge. Nice. So how are you mainly trying to get funding? Like, are you doing a lot of work to raise funds, like calling donors and various veterans groups, or how does that working for your group right now?
Yes, I mean, like I mentioned before, with the financial scholarship, we try to have people meet us halfway, just because we found that if they have skin in the game, they get much more out of it, as opposed to just like a free trip to Peru or whatever. So, I mean, that's one way that lowers our cost. And just working, we're trying to start a partnership with places like Retreat Guru online and potentially do individual fundraiser campaigns, come up with marketing material of sort of like a how to raise your own funds. So that's a work in progress for this year. So, you, Joe, would download this, and have graphics, images, and suggestions of like maybe go to a local CBD distillery or dispensary. I mean, maybe they might help, or maybe these organizations are much more likely to help in this cause, or this is the way you approach like a GoFundMe. Just setting up people for success. Like I mentioned, I think offline is we're in a very a rapidly changing world, and that the same is with nonprofits and fundraisers. So at the same time where it's easier to get money, it also makes it harder because there's more people asking for money. So like on Facebook, you have all these like personal donations. So people are asking for donations for their dog with cancer. People are asking for donations to go to their wedding of their dreams, this whole broad spectrum. And so it's harder to really stand out in that environment. And so small donations in general have gone down. And so we're just really trying to, we do that, but that puts a lot of pressure on your on your smaller circles, your friends and family. And so I'm trying to steer away from that because they've already helped out a lot. And just, I feel like the segment that we're in, I am confident that there are people out there that would really take to helping us out in a big way. I think our avenue to success is finding those institutions or those people that, understand the power of psychedelics and really want to help the veteran cause. And I've come across a lot of those. They just might not be able to help. And so just figuring that out, and that comes to being good at what we're doing, working on our message, and then just broadcasting it. And so like this veteran retreat that I mentioned, hopefully that's a good avenue to, one, let more veterans know that this is out there, but two, get to the channels that can help us. So potentially like a Joe Rogan or one of those channels where he can connect us to a wide variety of individuals that'd be like, oh yeah, I really like that. This is like a good path forward. And those who agree with our basic premise that veterans are one of the strongest ways we can push this message to politicians to reform drug policy. I always come at it from various different approaches, and hopefully something will full catch. But in the meantime, we just slowly push it forward in any way we can.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. I like the self-enablement aspect, and I think eventually the message will catch on for somebody who's fairly influential. It would be really interesting if there were good domestic options available to even further lower the cost. But I know that's something some of us are working on.
It's gray area too, and you have to people tend to be a little bit more nervous if they're doing a ceremony in the U.S. and how important set and setting is. So you don't want to already start them off in this sort of like hyper vigilant kind of state. So we're trying to figure that out. Yeah, and then another. I don't know. I've personally, just because part of, like I said, a component of what we're doing just to build our credibility and push the cause forward is trying to explore small studies we can do. So not on the MAPS level. To do clinical studies costs hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's not our goal. Our goal is more of a messaging marketing kind of spot of bringing good information there and having people question why things are the way they are. Whereas MAPS is doing a good sort of like broader, we're using the system the way it's meant to be used and pushing this forward little by little. And so with studies, I've noticed already just reaching out to various research institutions, it's already kind of starting to open up. There's a lot of places that are very interested in pursuing this line of study. Just in what we do, one of the things I've noticed is reaching out to researchers and certain universities. It's definitely opening up. There's a lot more researchers that probably wouldn't have taken my call or my email a couple of years back, but now are very intrigued in what we're doing. And at the very core, a researcher is just interested in finding the most interesting thing possible, and psychedelics are that. If you have any sort of study involved in the brain, it's very hard to deny. And so it's just a question of opening up a little bit more to where it's easier to get approval from review boards and universities. There's still apprehension, but you can see that loosening up. So, if we're able to get funding, we already have interest in being able to fully analyze like biologicals around psychedelic sessions. So that would be interesting because then that helps us point to anti-inflammatory effects. That helps us point to how it down the line affects cytokines and then later hormones and all sorts of a wide variety of things, which would really open up our understanding of the mechanisms in which they work.
Yeah, I've noticed a huge willingness of people in universities to this kind of research, even really small. So that's a really exciting thing to me. Just like the fact that they're willing to partner with smaller organizations like Psychedelics Today or Heroic Hearts, like it's really cool and really inspiring, because typically we think there's like maximum 3 organizations doing research, and there's a lot more than that.
Yeah, I mean it's picking up even on the universal level. There's somebody did like a PowerPoint slide, and it really makes you see it, of like University of Arizona. We're working with the University of Georgia. We've had interest of some schools in Denver, actually. Big ones like Yale, Johns Hopkins, all very high level universities, and they're all interested in this line of research.
Right. It looks like we're going to do some stuff with ASU and a Melbourne, some Australian university, I don't even know the name yet, around breathwork.
Okay.
I think as a control for an ayahuasca study, which is kind of cool. Lets me do more breathwork with people, which is always good.
Right.
Yeah. Have you tried holotropic breathwork?
No, I need to. It's on the long list of things I need to do, but I need to, one, just so I can better suggest it to other people, just because, like I said before, integration is such an important part, and ayahuasca or other psychedelics aren't necessarily always practical. And, I do believe that people can get a lot out of breath work. And it's even in ayahuasca ceremonies, particularly, I found just focusing on breath can really get you through some hard spots as well.
Right. Absolutely. So I did like 6 or 9 years of breath work before trying ayahuasca, or really any psychedelic compound. And it was of a tremendous help. It was quite the intense experience, obviously. And well, I guess it's not obvious because some people have like really wild experiences. Some people have fairly mild experiences, even with the same dose. So it's a complicated thing, but it was a tremendously powerful experience. And having the breathwork training was very helpful. Perhaps it would have been better if I suffered more, but just being able to keep the scenes rolling was, I think, the main trick.
Yeah, I think it can help with the veteran side too, because I haven't experienced as much as I thought, but there is a translation into the two worlds of being a veteran and the psychedelic and sometimes new age sort of world, or even just in terms of the indigenous beliefs. And so sometimes it can be a lot for somebody who's not used to a lot of that cultural perspective to full on grasp and take in. But a lot of veterans come from almost like an athletic background. And so I think breathing as well can be a good segue or a good bridge in between the two worlds.
Yeah, 100%. So let's talk about Colombia real quick. You're currently in Medellin, Colombia, which I think has some interesting ayahuasca laws. Are you familiar with the laws? And
I'm not familiar specifically with specific ones. Okay. I've tried. It's always hard to do research, but I know there's it's similar to other countries where there's indigenous rights aspect. And then other than that, there's just a lot of like gray area. And so a lot of the retreats here can't be as, they can fully function and operate, but they tend to not be as fully, they don't advertise as much as say like Iquitos, where it's pretty common.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And there are traditional users like I wish I remembered the name of the tribe. Kofi, does that sound right?
Yeah, it's something like that.
Yeah, very interesting group. I like their story. It's pretty killer. I've had it presented to me a couple times. So what kind of, let's see. So I have a good friend who's pretty hurt from being over in Iraq for years, a lot of deployments, a lot of tours, and the normal psych treatments don't seem the best. I've suggested you look at psychedelics a little bit, but didn't seem to like click. Is there a certain talk track you like to use when speaking with veterans, or should civilians just not really go there?
I mean, I never try to, I'm sure you're the same way. I never try to persuade anybody to do it. At the end of the day, it has to be their choice. And so I just try to present it in as straightforward a manner as possible. And that's just kind of like the facts. And I go over like some studies of like, hey, there's kind of like what I was saying earlier of like it can work on two levels. Like there is a hallucination effect, and it's not just escapism, but it can actually allow you to revisit traumas in almost like a controlled, less dangerous way. And then there's been a lot of evidence of more physiological effects on the brain as well. But I mean, at the end of the day, that's one of the things we're trying to do is veterans trust other veterans more so than they will anybody else. And so by having the people that we send and we connect to these therapies, by having them share their testimonials, I've had a lot of people come and be like, oh yeah, that really spoke to me. 'Cause it's even like what I was saying before of people don't feel like they have PTSD because they don't have that Hollywood version. And so when I talk to them about my experience of like, oh yeah, I have those same sort of things, I just thought it was, kind of normal, or I thought it was just nothing I could do about it. And, so, if you want, I can talk to him, or definitely just, I'll link you up to some of our testimonials. Sometimes that helps. I find with ayahuasca, particularly just talking with somebody about it kind of plants the seed, and eventually they just come to a point where nothing else is working because there's not really any other great alternatives right now. And they're just like, okay, maybe this is what I need to do.
Right. Cool. Well, yeah, that's good to know. I always find with veteran conversations, that's really the trick. Veterans do trust veterans a lot more than civilians. So people should keep that in mind.
Yeah, and that's part of the kind of a problem too. Is it's very easy for a lot of veterans to get into this mind frame that they're alone and that nobody else can understand what they're going through. And so, especially in group settings of like ayahuasca retreats, sometimes we just do private veteran retreats, but sometimes we just send like 2 or 3 guys and have them in a public retreat. And a lot of them will get a lot more out of it because they see that other people are suffering in their own unique ways too. And oftentimes there's a lot of like synergy, they may have not gone to Iraq and experienced combat, but, maybe they had some sort of trauma in their childhood and, or some sort of other violent instance. And getting veterans out of that mind frame helps them transition, and that's really a big aspect. It's hard for many to transition into civilian life, and so they may always be a little bit different, but opening them up to where they don't feel so isolated, so segregated is a big issue. And I think psychedelics can really help with that, and almost in the more ceremonial fashions. In modern times, we don't have these ceremonies. We don't have these becoming a man or coming of age ceremonies anymore. And so it's very hard for people to transition in their minds from different segments in their life, of whether coming from a girl to a woman, or man or boy to a man, or from this extreme world of the military where it works in a very specific way to the civilian world. And I think psychedelics can really help loosen the transition there.
Mm. Yeah, that's really great. It's the military is always a complicated subject to discuss, and especially in the States, given our history, and even more so being part of the psychedelic world. Everybody seems to be very radical left for the most part, and there's minimal centrism, and that kind of I think handicaps the conversation a bunch. So I hear all these awful criticisms of like, MAPS is just trying to make war cheaper, like awful comments like that, or MDMA is going to be used to, do drone warfare. It's like, that's kind of a misrepresentation. It's these people doing these jobs have trauma and they have baggage, and whose call is it to say they should stay sick? That's what a lot of people are like, we shouldn't do that for the military. It's like, no, you got to. These people, started when they were really young in this culture, and it wasn't even necessarily like, you're a little bit of a different case because you came in a bit later, but a lot of people jump in when they're 17.
Right.
And it's not their choice.
And like you said, it's complicated. I love my time in the military, and it's definitely a hard topic to reach to talk about because there's so many different factors of it. But I know a lot of guys that probably would have ended up in jail or overdosed had it not been for the military, and it really put their lives together. And it, like I said, it really serves as a becoming a man or becoming an adult experience for a lot of people. And even myself, there's no way in any other experience I would have been able to really understand and find the confidence physically and mentally in myself that I would without the challenges of the military. Unfortunately, there's some sort of intuition that pushed me to that, but I'm very grateful for that experience. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the problem with ideology and dogma, right? Is it loses your compassion, and it almost takes away your humanity. And you see that a lot in the U.S., especially now. We're so polarized that both sides are losing their humanity for the sake of just getting one up on the other side. And it's a ridiculous notion to not heal. And so I've heard the same sort of thing of, if we heal veterans, then it makes it more likely that politicians will go to war because they don't feel as bad that veterans are killing themselves and all this other kind of stuff. And my response to that is like, veterans have been having a pretty rough time for a while, and that hasn't paused war for a bit. Right. And it goes back to, I don't know, this is, from my perspective, more of a philosophical side of it. A veteran or a military person at its core, or a soldier at its core, in my mind, is a very noble sort of endeavor, noble profession. The person, from an outside level, without going into politics or specific wars, it's this person that is sacrificing their life, or even at the very least sacrificing their time for the sake of something that's much bigger than them, this idea or this nation, for other people, and they're putting themselves at risk for the sake of protecting these other people. And that at its core is what drives, there is this feeling in a lot of people, there is this sort of warrior spirit, and you see it throughout history. It's not just a cultural thing. Peace, the drive for peace and no war, is actually more of a cultural phenomenon nowadays than anything else. But the problem is, politicians are the ones that corrupt this virtuous sort of act in their own benefit. And so people get confused with the current wars and the roles of politicians. And there are bad soldiers, there are good soldiers, just like anything else. But people confuse the two, and they don't separate what this person's intention in going into it and what these politicians are using this sincere intention for. And I think that's where the conversation gets lost a little bit. And so to suggest not healing these certain groups, one, just on that very basis, I think it's not a humane thing to suggest in the first place. But look at what the people's intentions are, and let's try to find the commonality of, even though you don't associate with veterans or military, I'm sure there is still a lot of commonality, and that's kind of what we're trying to bridge. And surprisingly, I do come across that, and I just try to respond to it as respectful as possible. But surprisingly, there's been a lot of support in the psychedelic community. And I think there is a lot of overlap. I think just with social media and everything else that's going on, it's the radical opinions that tend to get more of the attention nowadays.
Yeah, with a lot of things, it's radical stuff seems more interesting for whatever reason. I was thinking about that today, actually, just like there's very few reasonable things being said these days. On TV and elsewhere. It's like, what is it going to take to get a culture to go get a little bit more reasonable? I don't know.
Well, yeah.
Perhaps more ayahuasca. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen some people that aren't, I don't think it's the cure all either. I've seen many people that have just as big of egos or as just as horrible people, even though they think they're more enlightened after a certain psychedelic trip. But yeah, I mean, and that's the other problem is information is great and it's wide access, but now that everybody has access, everybody thinks they're an expert and everything, and they feel like I have friends from the military who have like a college or a high school degree, and now all of a sudden they're like economic experts of international policy and all this other kind of stuff.
Right, which is a big deal. What do you have any opinions on like training and standards around psychedelic centers? We've had a really hard time making suggestions around where people should go. Would love to hear like how you do your criteria.
So like I said, if I can, I go to the center and just see how it feels and all this other kind of stuff. But at the very least, try to talk to the owners and the operators. It really kind of just comes down to their intention. I don't have like a specific guideline. Like I think hopefully that comes about at some point. I think as ayahuasca and other psychedelics get more commonplace, I think there really needs to be. It'd be nice if there's some sort of like certification program,
Right.
as long as that doesn't get corrupted in its own right. But really, just sort of the intentions of like if you just go to the retreat site. If the first thing they ask you for is the credit card, then maybe that's their intentions, not necessarily the therapy side. If there's a few steps and you have to answer like some questionnaires and stuff like that, then that's probably a better step. I try to stick with places that try to keep to respectful of traditional practices, oftentimes like Shipibo culture, and I think the tradition's very important in it. Generally, those that stick to like a pretty basic ayahuasca formula, I don't really, unless they're very good and they've been doing it for a long time. That's where the danger kind of arises if people start just adding random stuff into ayahuasca and they're not really that well versed into it, or people that just do like this whole like buffet line of different psychedelics. I try to stay away from that. If the person after they experience ayahuasca they want to do that on their own, that's fine. But for the initial meet and greet with ayahuasca, I think simpler is better. But I feel like a lot of times when you just talk to the retreats, you can kind of tell what they're after, and that they're really focused on if they're really focused on the individuals or not.
Right. After a period of time, you can definitely get to that. But it is a tricky landscape. I did a talk at Colorado State University at Fort Collins the other day, and somebody was asking me how do I navigate my way through this? And in Colorado, there's a lot of cults and a lot of like really negative facilitators popping up around this stuff. And, I just don't know how to teach people discernment yet in this space other than going really slow. It's like, maybe you want to drink it in a month or 3 months. Maybe you just extend that timeline out and take your time assessing what's going on and talking to more than just the facilitator, talking to maybe some of their customers in the past or whatever. It's a tricky conversation for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely tricky, and I'm not an expert. At the end of the day, I just tell people to get as much information similarly and trust their gut, because if they're already going in there nervous, then and that's like on a I guess institutional, I don't know if that's the right word, but on like a retreat basis, I feel like it becomes a little bit easier because they will have years of experience, generally speaking. And so like an easy one is like Temple Over the Way of Light, like in Peru. Like that's a lot of people know about it. They have a very good reputation. They've done research. They've worked on like integration. So that's one I feel comfortable like recommending to people in Peru if they want to go there. And there's like a few others like that, but that I just mentioned that one because they've been around for a while and they have their name in the game a lot. Whereas other ones where it's just like popped up and it's some guy from Florida that's been doing it for 1 year, I might be a little bit more hesitant on that.
Right. Right. Have you had much experience with the cultures, like the Shipibo cultures or various Amazonian groups? Or I've not really bumped into too much of it. I worked with one gentleman once who came up in that tradition, but not too much in general.
Not extensively. I hope to do more. Mostly just interactions with the shamans and just my own readings of the history. And I just kind of like that it's part of their culture. And, a lot of the more well-known shamans have been doing it their whole lives, and it's like a family heritage and all that. So I like that just on many different levels. If I had the time and the money, I'd definitely go down there and try to be more immersed in it. Because I definitely find that very interesting and important, I think, for moving forward as well. It's going to be one of the issues that we're going to have to pay attention to, especially as something like ayahuasca gains popular in the US is, we want to protect the culture. We want to protect sort of the Shipibo way of doing it and the traditionalism, and also just protect ayahuasca itself. You don't want, and that's another thing. You want retreats. You don't want retreats that are just going through the jungle and getting whatever they can get. And so it seems to be there seems to be pretty good movements, more so than there would be 50 years ago. And so there are a lot of retreats that have their own farms to grow ayahuasca and try to respect, only use Shipibo shaman or only use shaman that grow up in a certain culture and stuff like that. So I do see good sides as well.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But in the U.S., it's tricky. It's very tricky.
No doubt. Trying to think if there's anything else we need to touch on. Anything you feel like we haven't discussed yet that we want to get to?
I think we covered most of it.
Cool. Do you ever do any kind of meetups in the States at all for folks?
No, we need to work on, I want to work on that. When I send people, I try to send groups of friends, like people who serve together, or preferably who are in the same area. That way they have the built-in sort of support network. But yeah, as we expand, that's definitely going to be one of the ways we expand. And a place like Denver or Arizona, I think will be good means of testing that out, of just rebuilding local communities, where veterans can meet other veterans that have experienced this, but then also other people in the psychedelic community. And then that's also will be a good avenue for, local fundraisers. And then that way, when the veteran returns to that group, they already have this support network that helped them get this healing. And so all that, I think, is a very positive. It just takes, a lot of effort and sometimes some money. And so little by little, we'll build the path there. But yeah, a lot of it, and I think psychedelics are helping with this as well, is that social media is great in a lot of senses, but it is a big factor in our isolation and current sort of depression, anxiety, because it's kind of like living in a skyrise, like a skyscraper. The more people in that building, the less you know anybody in that building. Whereas if it's a small little brownstone with 5 other people, you're much more likely to have interactions with those people. And so now with social media, we have 500, 1,000 friends, but in terms of intimate encounters, it's much lower than it's ever been before. And so especially with veterans, because they come from such strong brotherhood of people closer than family, and then they disperse because of work or whatever, and so they just feel super isolated. And so rebuilding these communities, these tribes, I think is essential in the mental health scape going forward.
Absolutely. I'd love to donate time and my equipment to do breathwork workshops to your group. If we ever are able to put one together, I'd love to either provide that for free for veterans or make it a fundraiser for your group. I think that would be great.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely appreciate that. I think it would be a tremendous help.
Great. Cool. So can you give us the name of your website and how to get in touch?
Yeah, so it's heroicheartsproject.org, HEROICHEARTS project.org. If you're a veteran, there's a veteran application on there that you can fill out. Otherwise, there's like a contact form. There's a donate button. If you feel the need to donate, it very much help us. We also have a Patreon, so even if it's just a couple of bucks a month, again, that just really helps us keep the lights on and support the veterans. None of our staff take any money. 100% of all donations go directly towards facilitating veterans going towards this therapy. And then on social media, we have Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Twitter's We Heroic Hearts. The rest you can find it by Heroic Hearts Project. So yeah, I mean, definitely just reach out. Especially going into 2020, if we're better positioned, we would really like to have more of a stake in the conversation. I think it's next year's election, whatever side you're on, is going to be important in a lot of ways. And I do think that drug policy and the veteran issues are huge things that need to be addressed. And so we just want, very simple questions to be asked out there, like why is no government funding going to the biggest breakthrough in PTSD research through the MAPS MDMA therapy? Not 1 cent of government money has gone to that. And why are we having to send veterans to other countries to get them the mental health treatment that they deserve? I think these questions really need to be brought forth to politicians, because they're always the ones that first say they support veterans, and there's this juxtaposition of what's actually happening. So
right. Well, thank you, Jesse Gould. It was amazing chatting with you, and I really hope we can get you back on the show in 6-9 months or something, see where you're at with the project.
Yeah, definitely. I'd love to. We have some big things going on, and so I'd love to discuss them. Hopefully they're all successful. But yeah, Joe, thanks so much for having me and giving us a platform to share our message.
And there you have it. Jesse Gould with the Heroic Hearts Project. What do you think? Let us know. You can join in on the conversation over at our Facebook group, Psychedelics Today group. You can email us. Let us know what you think. psychedelicstoday@gmail.com. Or you could leave a review on iTunes or Facebook or something. That would be really cool too. So if you want to support the show, we would love to have you join us in one of these live Navigating Psychedelics classes. Check those out over at psychedelicstodayshop.com. We've also got a Patreon page where you can leave a small monthly donation as low as $2 a month. We would love that. We've also got books on Amazon. Check them out. Just search Navigating Psychedelics or Integration Workbook or Trip Journal. Those things should make it come up. So thanks again for listening. Share this with your friends, and this wouldn't work without you. So thanks for listening. This is Joe Moore signing off from Breckenridge, Colorado. Bye-bye from Psychedelics Today.